Hello everyone, I'm here standing outside the tiles that are remembering our 50th year anniversary. And these tiles, they show and express the different families as well as the different things that have happened in our church. And they're meant to be here so that every time we walk by, we can remember what God is doing and has done in our church. And I think this is a theme that was taking place in Pastor Bruce's sermon just last week. One of the stories that Pastor Bruce references is the story that takes place in Matthew 16. In Matthew 16, from verses 5 all the way through 12, there's an interaction where Jesus is talking to the disciples about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And to teach his point, Jesus brings up the idea of leaven and bread. Instead of focusing on what Jesus is saying, though, the disciples get distracted and they start thinking about how they didn't bring any bread, and they start to worry. The funny thing about this, though, is that the story in Matthew 16 takes place not too long after Jesus had just fed thousands. And Jesus references that in this very passage. Jesus says, "How are you worrying about bread? Don't you remember? Don't you remember what I just did? Don't you remember who I am?" And while we read the story, we could kind of think of it a little humorous, but at the same time, it should be humbling and convicting. Because how often do we forget who Jesus is? And do we forget the ways that Jesus has moved in our lives? I want to encourage you this week to read this passage. It's down below. And to spend some time remembering, first of all, who Jesus is. And second of all, what he's done for you. Because we can see that in our lives when we forget who Jesus is and we forget his power, worry, fear, and sin enters our world and enters our lives. So spend some time this week, read this passage, pray, and remember who Jesus is.